Good afternoon, and thank you for taking some time to join us on all of the social media platforms as we're talking about tonight's debate. I am political anchor Ashley Goudeau for KVUE News. I am joined by Ashley Lopez, who is a reporter with KUT 90.5, your favorite radio station, right? That's the one everybody listens to?
Yeah, it better be.
Yeah, and Patrick Svitek, who is the primary political correspondent for the Texas Tribune, which is clearly the only online political.
It is my favorite online news nonprofit based in Austin.
Right, so basically we've got you covered. Your favorite TV, favorite radio, and favorite online nonprofit news organization to watch. And tonight we are coming together to host a debate with 11 of the Democrats who are fighting to challenge U.S. Senator John Cornyn. First and foremost, let's talk a little bit about this race overall. Senator Cornyn is a three-term senator from Texas, and he has had a long political career, but after particularly how close former Congressman Beto O'Rourke came to defeating Senator Ted Cruz, a lot of Democrats decided to kind of throw their hats in the ring for this race. Patrick, are you at all surprised by the number of people, just the sheer number of Democrats who are running?
You know, not that much. Like you pointed out, the breakthrough success, while he did not win, the Beto O'Rourke's ability to come pretty close to Ted Cruz in 2018, I think showed a lot of Texas Democrats what could be possible, and it set the stage for a pretty competitive and crowded race this time around to take on Cornyn.
But Ashley, do you think maybe the Democratic Party should have had more of a hand in limiting the number of people, or should we have had this big of a primary?
I think every time the Democratic Party tries to step in and stuff like this, it doesn't work out for them. It seems to create more problems than it solves. But yeah, I mean, you're looking at this nationally too. It's like it's harder for voters when there's this many options, just because who has the time to sift through this many candidates. But I don't know. I feel like maybe it's best that sort of parties kind of stay back and let sort of voters step in, even though it's a little harder.
And you had some high-profile Democrats who could have considered running or were encouraged to run and chose not to. They probably would have cleared the field a little bit, and this would have been a smaller race. I'm thinking of people like Joaquin Castro, who was very open in his consideration of this race earlier last year, and then Beto O'Rourke, who obviously there was a wave of encouragement for him to get into the race while he was running for president,
right.
And then after, when he got out running for president, that drumbeat never really stopped. So if one of those figures had gotten in, maybe you could have seen a smaller race, but they didn't, and this is the wide open primary I think we have partly as a result. Yeah,
and so of course we encourage you guys to do your own research on all of these candidates, but we are here to help sort of lay a groundwork for you about who these people are, why they're running, and what they're running on, and as we preview tonight's debate. And as you mentioned, no really big names in the race, and that is really clear when we look at the polling. In February this month, the University of Texas Politics Project, along with the Texas Tribune, polled Texas voters, and they asked Democratic voters, people who plan to vote in the Democratic primary, as well as people who lean Democrat, who they plan to vote for in the race during this primary election, and 22% of them said they are going with MJ Hagar. She leads the pack, but Patrick, is this really a big lead?
It is not. In this most recent poll, it's the biggest lead that I've seen for her, but it's still not a huge, overwhelming lead. I think if you had to bet what a runoff would look like nowadays, I think MJ Hagar is a relatively clear favorite to make it into that runoff. And it's a real question of who's going to be in that number 2 spot, which this most recent poll shows that there's kind of a jumble of candidates competing for that number 2 spot if you accept that premise.
Right, and Ashley, talk to us a little bit about that number 2 spot and the people who, they're all kind of coming in less than 10%.
Yeah, so Cristina Cincin Ramirez, this is the first time she's run for public office, I believe.
Correct.
But she's been in Democratic politics for a little while now. She, after Trump was elected, built a voter mobilization group focused on young voters, mostly voters of color, like Latinos mostly, because that's, every 30 seconds a Latino becomes voting age in Texas. That is a very big future part of the electorate. So she has a lot of ties to kind of voting groups on the ground because she's been doing this for the past couple of years. But she's probably one of the more progressive candidates in the race, from what I can tell. She supports from what I believe, the Medicare for All healthcare plan, which is a good indicator of where people stand on stuff like that. So, but other than that, she's new to politics as a running for public office.
Yeah. So let's kind of go down the line here and talk about each one of these candidates. Let's start with combat veteran MJ Hagar. Again, she got 22% of the vote. She's a mom. She lives right here in Central Texas, and she really became, to notoriety, if you will, in 2018 when she decided to take on Republican Congressman John Carter and came very, very close to beating him.
Yes, it was an unexpectedly competitive race. She released this biographical ad, Doors, that went viral, helped her raise a bunch of money.
She got national attention for that ad.
Exactly, and in some ways that district, traditionally Republican district, she was able to make a close race out of it. It's kind of a template for, running statewide in Texas, a state that, is still a very solidly Republican-leaning state, and where a Democrat is going to have to be able to mount a very serious, well-funded campaign to get close, as we saw with Beto O'Rourke last cycle. So in some ways, I think that she's trying to take that race, or at least the task for her is to take that district statewide in some ways. She's running very heavily on her military experience, on being, and all the trials and tribulations of that, on being a mom. She's actually spoken relatively openly about how a lot of Texans, or a significant chunk of the electorate, doesn't really care about policy. They want someone who they can relate to and that they can trust is going to go fight for them. And so she's, I think, been making a bit of a unique appeal in that regard. And at the same time, she's been running this campaign that's almost exclusively focused on John Cornyn, trying to keep an eye pretty, directly fixed on the general election.
Yeah, you mentioned that you need money in order to win an election like this, and she has gotten a lot of donations, and some of them from outside of Texas, and that's something that people have been coming down and criticizing her about.
Sure. When she launched her campaign, she had some celebrities in her launch video that John Cornyn's campaign very quickly criticized her as a result of. They called her Hollywood Hagar. A lot of these candidates, are not getting all their donations from Texas. I mean, right now it's throughout this race, the fundraising has been relatively low, and these candidates are looking for money everywhere they can find it. So I don't think for them at this point it's necessarily top of mind, where they're getting their donations from in terms of geography. I think fundraising has been a bit of a struggle for all these folks. If you just look at the overall numbers and how relatively low they are, so they're taking money where they can get it from, I think.
Yeah,
But that being said, MJ Hagar has been the top fundraiser by a relatively healthy margin.
Yeah, and she gets a lot of criticism too because of the endorsement she got from the other senators who are currently serving in the U.S. Senate. The Democrats, their campaign arm, selected her as who they're endorsing. Getting involved in this race, is that tricky, Ashley, to have Washington involved in this Texas race?
Yeah, especially since it's a tenet of a lot of political campaigns to kind of run against DC in a way, because you want to be the one who, you want to position yourself to be the one to change things, especially since Congress is at an all-time low in terms of favorability among reporters. Among voters. So it's voters, not reporters. And so, that is a little tricky, and that has not worked well in the past for other candidates. It's been a thing that other candidates have thrown at them. It's a good, it's like red meat sometimes. Yeah. I
mean, it's a double-edged sword for any candidate that gets an endorsement. They view it obviously as a validation of how strong of a campaign they've been running, that the national campaign arm would recognize them like that, and that with that endorsement comes a bunch of other national connections and national money and influence. But on the other side of it, you open yourself up to criticism from your primary rivals, whether it's criticism about the DSCC, kind of overlooking the diversity of the electorate, or overlooking the diversity of this particular primary field, or in MJ Hagar's case, it creates this tension of someone who is running as a political outsider, someone who's not been in office and is kind of just an average working mom and veteran, who is now, has the support of effectively Washington insiders. And so, again, a double-edged sword for any candidate, I think, that gets that endorsement.
Yeah, I don't know how you get away from outside money or attention just because of how the Beto Cruz election played out. That was one of the most expensive races in the country, the Senate races of all time. And now that elections look like they're getting closer statewide in Texas, it's it's a big project for Democrats nationwide to start winning elections here. So I don't know how you kind of avoid that moving forward.
You know, the other thing with that is these candidates can say what they want to say. Anyone would have been happy to have that endorsement. Anyone would have loved probably to have that endorsement and would have considered it a feather in the cap. Okay, let's move on to Cristina Ramirez, who, as we mentioned, is the founder of JOLT. That's that civic organization that tries to mobilize Latino voters. She also co-founded the Workers' Defense Project. And as you mentioned, she is one of the most progressive candidates in this race.
Yeah, she, like you mentioned a couple of times, she gets referred to as like AO Cristina. She's already getting kind of pinned as being an AOC type candidate. You know, she's a younger Latina who has progressive policies, so I guess that kind of like makes sense. But you know, she's running in Texas. Let's see how, like, if she makes it to the runoff and wins, like how being that progressive appeals to a general election electorate in Texas. But yeah, so she at this point has picked, like, the Green New Deal is another thing that she has like said that she would endorse if she were in the Senate, which is another very progressive policy that sort of the left side of the Democratic Party has rallied around.
Yeah, she's very open about her background, about her father being Irish American, her mother being Mexican American, and growing up in these kind of two different, you know, these two different families, and how that makes her more relatable to all Texans.
Yeah, and I think that she's, you know, in sharing that story, she's trying to appeal to the diversity of the Texas electorate, where sometimes these questions are not necessarily, you know, straightforward, you know, having, you know, parents all from the same place or something like that. And so I think that does resonate in a state like Texas. I think it's politically, you know, her path is trying to kind of present herself, and she can claim this with some plausibility, that she's kind of the viable, serious progressive in this race. Because of course you have multiple candidates here saying, I'm progressive, or people claiming I'm the most progressive. She's raised more than a lot of these candidates. She has the platform, and I think some of the state and national endorsements to plausibly say that I'm the, you know, if you want a progressive who actually is going to be able to go the distance in this race, then I'm your pick. But that's not to say, again, that there are other people in this race that are obviously throwing around that term and trying to claim that mantle.
Yeah, well, and one of the things I think is interesting, the other reason why she's trying to claim this, and we also hear this from Amanda Edwards, who we're going to talk in more detail about later, though, but she argues that she can get those millennial voters. They both argue they can get the millennials, that they can bring together a diverse group of voters.
Right, and she has, you know, at least Cristina Ramirez, you know, has the background to, you know, somewhat support that, given her work with the Workers' Defense Project and JOLT, both groups that are very organizing intensive, and especially JOLT, you know, which has sought to tap into the kind of rising political power of Latino youth in Texas.
Yeah. Moving on to former Congressman Chris Bell, as his name states. He was a former congressman representing a part of Houston before the lines were redrawn. He also was a Houston City Council member as well as a Texas gubernatorial candidate, saying that his experience is why voters should elect him, but only got 7% in this poll. Patrick.
Yeah, he is running. We have a number of candidates in this field running on experience. He's running on specifically his experience, I think, in Congress, which was, you know, quite a long time ago. It was in the early 2000s, but it was an interesting 2 years that he spent in Congress. He filed the kind of ethics complaint that people attribute to leading up to the downfall of Tom DeLay. And so he has certainly had that one term in Congress was certainly action-packed, we'll put it that way. He ran for governor unsuccessfully after he got redistricted out of his congressional district in 2006. And so it remains to be seen whether this is like recent enough experience for him to be able to push himself to the front of the pack in this race. But like I said, you know, that term in Congress certainly you know, is I think a strong experience to at least stake, you know, that experience-based pitch on.
Yeah, that you at least are the one candidate who's been to Washington amongst all these.
Exactly.
Candidates.
Yeah, I should have just said that. That's what he's stating very plainly in a lot of these forums. Is, you know, I'm the only one here who's actually served in Congress.
Yeah, and you know, he uses that ethics reform because he broke the truce. Right, there was sort of this truce about how, you know, members, the representatives got along, and he's like, I broke it. I'm all about ethics reform. I'm going to clean up and give us clean government again. Do you think that's something you're hearing that voters want, though, Ashley?
Well, anti-corruption policies and like sort of ethics legislation are polling really well in, you know, the age of Trump. I mean, that could be a very useful platform, you know, especially in light of you know, the impeachment hearings, they've been raising a lot of questions. Like, I mean, apparently all sort of fixes we have for anything we might deem unethical seems to be political. So having something sort of in law that kind of checks anything that we, you know, anything corrupt, you know, like that would be really appealing to voters. There's a lot of, I think that's why you see some presidential candidates running on anti-corruption. It's polling very well. So if, you know, he can get through, I mean, it's a crowded field, right? And so it's hard to make issues kind of come to the fore when people don't really know who you are. But if he's able to kind of push through and like talk about issues that voters like, I mean, this is true of all candidates, that would be effective. But, you know, I don't know how much in Texas we're talking about ethics reform in general.
I was just going to add, in the latest wave of results that came from this UT Texas Tribune poll, I think Texas voters were asked what their top issues were, and I think in the top 3 or 4 was political corruption / political leadership, which is a big umbrella, but you can see how that, you know, that priority focus on that issue could benefit someone like Bell.
Right. Up next is former Houston City Council member Amanda Edwards, who had an at-large seat in the city of Houston. She really prides herself on the fact that she is a millennial who she feels can bring people together opposed to having divisive politics. She's promising for results, not rhetoric. She especially wants to increase access to health care. And honestly, I was surprised to see her come in and, you know, with only 6% in this poll, because she's done better in other polls.
Correct. She's picked up a little momentum recently, gotten some of the major city newspaper editorial board endorsements. You know, she was elected once citywide in Houston, so there's obviously some familiarity that comes with that. But it's only once. She's now she gave up her seat to focus on this race. She didn't seek re-election, so she's former council member Edwards now. And she's, I think, statewide, you know, she benefits in this race from being something of a fresh face, obviously well known in Houston, but I think that in this particular field, she definitely is one of the people who can more plausibly claim that she's a fresh face to a statewide audience.
And actually, that's what the Democratic Party is kind of trying to get, right? They want more fresh faces, if you will, in candidates that are running and elected officials.
Yeah, especially, you know, Texas, I don't know that everyone knows this, but it's like the 3rd youngest state in the nation. So like, you know, we have a pretty young electorate. We have a very young population. Our electorate has been a little slow to, you know, catch up.
We know we've got to work on people voting in Texas.
Well, and I mean, that's going to be the big project for Democrats. I mean, if you were to hold an election today, you know, like the odds don't look as good as if they were to grow the electorate, add more of those young people, those people of color who tend not to vote in elections. So, you know, adding someone young, a millennial could be really helpful and, you know, directly appealing to those younger voters.
That's her argument. She feels like she could have the potential to bring out that same number of voters, that same momentum that Beto O'Rourke did. Do you see that, though? Because at this point in his campaign, I mean, Beto like overwhelmingly won his primary.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because Beto O'Rourke, the time he was running is very different from now. It was right after that Trump was elected. That was the most sort of emotional and like that you saw the Democratic Party and Democratic voters. So people were really looking for candidates. You know, it's been a couple of years since then. You know, it's hard to tell whether there's the same amount of momentum. So like, I think any candidate's gonna have a hard time trying to meet the sort of momentum and emotionality that like was alive during that race. Also money, that was a very different kind of situation. Right. Yeah, and she's trying to like, she also wants to appeal to the suburban voters that Beto O'Rourke won, and that's hard to do. It's hard to get young progressive voters who maybe want more progressive policies, and then some of the more center-left constituencies that live in the suburbs, which helped bring Beto O'Rourke. So it's tough. It's going to be tough for any candidate, but yeah, especially in this case.
Patrick.
Yeah, I mean, she's speaking very openly on the campaign trail about being able to bring together that coalition of the suburban voters that we saw ascendant in not only Beto O'Rourke's Senate race in 2018, but some of the congressional races in 2018. Bring together that group with voters of color and young people who turned out for Beto O'Rourke in 2018, but not at the levels that Democrats in this state still need to win statewide, and then win over some independents and potential, Republican or Republican-leaning voters. So she's been very outspoken, and being able to build a coalition of those three groups will obviously, have a report card on that when it's election time. So, but she's no doubt been, I think, one of the more overt candidates in this race, talking about being able to build that coalition.
Yeah. Up next, also getting 6% in this latest poll, is State Senator Royce West, who has represented the people of Dallas in the Texas legislature for 27 years. He says now he's ready to take all that experience, all the work that he's done to Washington. And his point is, you can tell what a person is going to do by what they've done. And if you look at my track record, if you look how I voted on health care, and if you look how I voted on women's rights and immigration and things of that nature, while the Democrats obviously don't have majority in the Texas Senate, and some of those things, some of those efforts fail, his point is, you know what I'm going to do when I get to Washington, and I can take on President Trump.
Right, he's running hard on his experience, and he's the only person in this field who actually has I would say not a voting record. Chris Bell has a voting record, but who has an actual recent voting record where you can actually hold him to account. So that is clearly his lane here. He has embraced that while also trying to position himself opposite Donald Trump. We've seen some recent messaging from him where he's critical of John Cornyn, of course, but he's also trying to add trying to triangulate between that and being someone who can stand up to Donald Trump in the U.S. Senate, which you don't hear as much from the other candidates, at least at this juncture in the race. They're talking about John Cornyn, but they're not necessarily bringing Trump into it in the way that Royce West is. And so that's been what I've been able to ascertain, at least recently, of his pitch.
One of the things I think is interesting about that, and you mentioned that, is that when Senator West first announced that he's going to be in the race, John Cornyn immediately went into attack mode. There were other candidates who had announced at that point, but his first ad was launched against Senator Royce West, kind of calling him this liberal, candidate. And that was interesting because it indicated early on that at least he thought Senator West was going to be the candidate. We saw that with Governor Greg Abbott when he ran against Sheriff Valdez, who he just constantly didn't even mention the other Democrats in the race. He just solely focused on, her. And that's kind of what Cornyn was doing initially. But has that support seemed to fade away now that we have so many other candidates?
Yeah, the Cornyn re-election campaign, its first TV ad was, I think it was during one of the Democratic presidential primary debates, and it was an attack ad against Royce West. Obviously, there are different ways to interpret the strategy of that. One of them that I choose to theorize is that they're trying to elevate Royce West. They would like to face him in the general election for whatever reason. One reason that you could speculate is, again, the voting record. Again, while that could be an advantage in some cases, you're a reliable person. You can run on your experience. You can point to things that you've actually done and voted on. That could also be vulnerability. Texas senators, state senators, Texas state lawmakers take a lot of votes. Not every vote looks great in additional political context, especially when you're being under fire, under attack. So
and over 27 years.
Sure, exactly. Yeah. So that may be a reason why the Cornyn campaign was eager to elevate him, or maybe they are truly scared of him.
Yeah, Senator West has a lot of support in Dallas, Ashley, but not necessarily everywhere else around the state.
Yeah, not everyone knows even who their own state senator is, and not a lot of people pay attention to the ledge. So to a lot of voters, unless you live in Dallas and have paid attention to your local leaders, you're unlikely to know who they are. Although he has been pretty vocal in some really bigger fights in the legislature. He's, because he's been there so long, he's like an old guard. But, other voters, I think when you look at the polls, it's clear his biggest liability is that women, people are looking for more women to run for office. Just it's not a coincidence that two young women or women are leading in the polls, because this has been a trend for the past couple of years. So, we're looking, to see who can kind of break through that, what the sort of the top of the pack looks like. And, I think he doesn't really have anything too flashy to sort of, break through right now. He's been in the state Senate for a long time, and that's kind of like a lot of what we know about him right now.
On the point about his statewide recognition, he has been able to get endorsements from a number of his legislative colleagues from throughout the state, a number of prominent local elected officials. Probably the most prominent is Houston Mayor Sylvester Turner. So he's
Who picked him over Amanda Edwards?
Sure,
Yeah.
and Chris Bell and maybe other Houstonians in this race. So I think that is helpful for him. With those endorsements, it's always a question of not just getting the endorsement, but what is that person, how's that person helping you, and what kind of profile does that person have in the community, and how much influence and clout do they have to spread the word about you. So I just wanted to point out that he has this statewide endorsement network.
Yeah, for sure. Moving now to Sema Hernandez, who got 5% in this latest poll, and she's another one of those, when we talk about some of the most progressive candidates running, she definitely takes on part of that title as well. Particularly, she wants to focus on the climate. Ashley, do you want to start talking a little bit about Sema?
Yeah, Sema's interesting because she did very well, considering how little money she had when she ran against Beto O'Rourke in the primary. He really underperformed in Latino parts of the state, and she did really well. So she has a good history with Latino voters, that's been proven. So it'll be interesting to see if there is a good Latino turnout, how she does. And I think she's also kind of seeing soon Ramirez running as a little more progressive, on the more progressive end of things. So that's about.
Yeah, she likes to tout that she only had $4,000, Patrick, and got, I think it was 24% somewhere in there of the vote. But again, a win, that's not a win though.
Right, and fundraising remains low, and I don't think she filed her most recent fundraising report, at least last time I checked. I mean, in terms of fundraising in this primary field, after you get past MJ Hagar, Christina Zinzin Ramirez, Chris Bell, Amanda Edwards, and Royce West, there's been a huge drop-off. And so these are people that just don't have the resources and, are relying on other opportunities to get their name in front of voters. But there's no doubt that, Sema Hernandez is a, relatively unique voice in this field. She's very open about the fact that she's not a, quote, normal politician and speaks her mind, and that's made for some interesting forums and some interesting interviews. And so, she's no doubt a factor in the race, I think, as a result of that.
I think so, too. Unapologetically human is how she phrases it. And so, we kind of expect that we may have some moments from her tonight during the debate. Moving on to...
You want me to provide a comment on that?
No, we're just going to leave that alone. You guys just have to watch that tonight. When we think about Annie Mama Garcia, who, sort of her slogan is that she's one fed-up mama. That is how she is. She's running. She's an attorney from Houston, is, sort of her day job. Really wants to see access to universal health care because her children, her youngest child was born in Spain and had a heart defect, and so had to get care there in Spain. When we sat down and talked about her platform, she mentioned how much more expensive it was to get care here in America once they moved back, and how she still takes her child to Spain to get this health care because it's unaccessible to someone like her here in America. Your overall thoughts on her, Patrick?
Yeah, she's the latest. She was the latest entrance in this primary field. Got in just a few days, I think, before the filing deadline. And you're right. I mean, she's running as, I think, a total political outsider. As you said, she's presenting herself as one fed-up mama. Obviously, MJ Hagar is also running as an outsider and a mother, but she ran for Congress last cycle, and obviously has the DSCC endorsement in this race. Annie Garcia is, I think, trying to, really position herself as someone totally outside the system, totally foreign to the political system, and she is going on a walk across Texas to draw attention to her campaign, walking a number of non-contiguous routes, I think totaling over 400 miles, 420 miles. And so, I think she is unique in that regard. But again, you get to a certain point in this field, and people have just not been able to raise the money to run, a race that's going to be ready for November. And so these are people who are trying to catch lightning in a bottle in some ways.
Yep. Michael Cooper is another one of those candidates. I'm sorry, Ashley, do you want to talk about Mama?
I mean, I think it's smart to talk about healthcare and costs. I mean, if we look at polling of like people's biggest like pocketbook issues, it's like they're afraid of getting a surprise medical bill and they can't afford all of their premiums and most of their out-of-pocket costs. So I think it's smart to focus on healthcare. I think any candidate who's like, talks about that a lot will break through a little bit because this is an issue that voters care a lot about.
Especially in Texas when we have the highest uninsured rate for adults and children.
And it's getting worse, for the first time since the Obama administration, when Obamacare passed, our rates went down, and now they're picking back up again, especially among children, and that's a concerning stat for anyone.
Absolutely. Michael Cooper, when I get with him, he is a car salesman as well as a pastor. He's the president of the NAACP in Beaumont, which is where he lives. Again, he also is someone who ran for governor, ran a statewide campaign, but did not get the nomination.
Yeah, I mean, I think one unique thing that's a little bit overlooked about him in this field is he's the only candidate who actually has recent experience running statewide in Texas, which, as you pointed out, he ran last cycle for lieutenant governor. He lost the primary, Democratic primary to Mike Collier, but I think got in the 40s or something like that. So had certainly a respectable showing in that primary. And he was actually actively, it wasn't just someone who threw his name on the ballot last cycle. He was actually actively campaigning in that race. And I believe that he actually afterward helped campaign with Mike Collier when Mike Collier was the nominee against the Republican incumbent Dan Patrick. So he is someone in this field who I think has the most recent political statewide experience. As you can see from the poll numbers, as you can see from his fundraising, hasn't necessarily turned that into a super serious, super viable campaign yet, but he definitely brings that asset into the race.
Yeah, but do you think people who voted for him, again, that's pretty, I mean, to get 40%, and I said governor earlier, I meant to say lieutenant governor, to get that much of the electorate, do you feel as though maybe some of those people will come out and support him again?
They may. I mean, Summer Hernandez is facing the same question. Are the 24% of voters who voted for her in the 2018 primary all going to come back for this? Probably not. They obviously have other choices. They may not have when they voted for her or when people voted for Michael Cooper in 2018. They may have had different thinking and may have not been voting necessarily off of knowing the candidate, but having other decisions or other factors on their mind. So I don't think you can necessarily count on all those voters coming over, but for both these candidates, there's no doubt that that's a consideration, is how much they can rely on those voters coming back out for them.
Right.
Yeah, especially remembering their platforms and all that from like 2 years ago. That feels like so far from now.
Right. Well, and people change. Man, they're not necessarily loyal. There is no loyalty in politics. We know that. Changing now to Colonel Victor Hugo Harris, who got 2% in this poll. He, again, just went to the Army Reserve, so has 34 years of military experience, and says that because of that experience, because he has served under, I believe it's 4 presidents, he feels as though he has the knowledge, he has that experience to be able to go to Washington and actually make some changes and some difference. And what he really is running on is immigration. That is the big thing on his platform. Ashley, talk to us a little bit about what he said.
Well, his experience is interesting. He lived in Mexico as a child for a while and then moved over to the Rio Grande Valley. So he has a really intimate experience with the border and immigration issues. So he, obviously, like a lot of Democrats, is unhappy with the way that the Trump administration has been rolling out various immigration policies and the sort of effect that's had on families and people who are choosing to cross the border. And so that's been a big part of his platform, as well as, because he's been in the military, he's touted, he could easily say he's one of the few candidates who's ready to talk about foreign policy tomorrow, which in the Senate, that's a lot of the work that senators would have to do all the time. That's a big part of what the Senate is tasked with. So I think that's an interesting piece on his resume there.
And that is important to point out, that they do have to talk about foreign policy, and so it raises the question about experience in dealing with foreign policy. Patrick?
Yeah, I mean, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but he and MJ Hager are the only people with military experience in this field. That obviously in any political race gives you a unique vantage point. And I think in this race it's particularly salient for him because the only other person with military experience is someone who is, I don't want to call her the front runner, but someone who is a leading candidate. And so that gives him an opportunity to go toe-to-toe with her on that issue if he so chooses.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if he will choose to do so tonight during the debate. All right. So actually, like we mentioned, there are 12 candidates in the debate, but if you've been paying attention, you've seen that there are only 11 participating in tonight's debate, and that is because we sent invitations to Mr. D.R. Hunter, have tried on numerous occasions to reach out to him unsuccessfully, have not heard from him. Have you heard from him, Patrick, in your efforts?
I have not, no.
No, and Ashley either. So we've all tried to find out more. We'd love to even show you a picture of him, but we can't do that because we don't have a picture because we can't find a website. But he still came in at 1%. So someone knows him and what he has done and what he has to offer.
It's an interesting campaign strategy.
Yes, indeed. Moving right along to Mr. Adrian Osegueda, who is a equity principal, and he is very interesting in that he sort of takes issue with the whole system of politics as it is now. Would you like to shed a little light on that, Patrick?
Well, we should also note that he has recent statewide campaigning experience to amend maybe what I said about Michael Cooper earlier, although I don't know how actively he campaigned. He ran for governor in the gubernatorial primary in 2018, came in pretty far in the back of the pack. And as you pointed out, he is someone who is very upset with politics as it exists today and wants to change the political system. I think he talks about campaign finance reform on the campaign trail is just one example, ethics reform. And so I expect to hear a lot of that from him. And he's also from El Paso and touts the unique perspective I think that you can get on the border situation from being from a city like El Paso.
Yeah, he sort of takes issue with the way we do politics, and he feels like there should be more attention from the citizens. But actually, that's what we argue too, right? Is that the people should pay attention.
I think that's a common gripe, and it's fair in a lot of ways. Like I think you can make a case that a lot of the ways that we, handle elections and the way we talk about politics could be improved upon. I think that's fair.
Right, that we do surface level chatting about politics.
But when you have 12 candidates, it's really hard to get very granular, especially when not everyone has a position on like all these things that are important to voters. It can get difficult, but I guess I can hear his complaint.
Yeah. The last candidate that we're going to chat about today is Jack Daniel Foster Jr., who is an educator in Dayton. He lives in Baytown, Texas, so this is outside of Houston. And he is touting that he is the only candidate with an economic plan. The economic plan, just to summarize it for you guys, basically, he wants to give every county or county-like entity within the United States of America, he wants them to start funds, and people would be able to get money back, the property owners and the homeowners, so that they can use these funds to sort of better your standing. You could go to trade school, you could get education. He calls it like an incentive program, if you will. It's an interesting proposal. And to pay for it, he thinks we should go, further into debt. But again, he's saying, I'm the only one with an economic strategy. Your thoughts, Patrick?
I'm not too familiar with his plan. I know that other candidates, have put forward at least kind of a vision on economic issues, and so he may be the only candidate in the field to have a super detailed plan. I've seen him at a few forums, and he is definitely one of the more candid and unvarnished candidates. Maybe put him in the Hernandez category in this primary field. But he is also someone who is, again, we're getting into the area here where these people are, not raising a lot of money, don't have a lot of name ID, and so, they really need to have, kind of catch lightning in a bottle to really break through, even if they have some interesting assets, as you pointed out, him having a detailed economic plan.
Yeah, and when you talk about no name recognition, you got 0% in this poll. Ashley, anything to add on Mr. Foster?
Well, I don't know how feasible like a property tax plan would be on a federal level.
Right.
That's an open question. And also, if homeowner, I don't know that like polls says out that home ownership is probably the most important pocketbook issue on people's minds. Like this is something that's very important above other things. Like I would argue healthcare is an economic plan, and everyone seems to have one of those. So we'll see, right?
Yeah, we will definitely see. So we again invite you all to join us. I guess overall, guys, who or what are you going to be looking for tonight? What has to stand out to you? Ashley, you go first.
I'm interested to see, especially the top two candidates, Hager and Ramirez. They have very different visions about like what the Democratic priority should be. And so, Hagar's a little more center left. Ramirez is definitely more progressive. So I'm interested in seeing those kind of exchanges.
Patrick, what are you watching for tonight?
Yeah, I'm interested to see the interactions between the non-MJ Hagar, more serious candidates, so people like Sinsun Ramirez, Bell, Edwards, West. Because, again, we've seen in the polling that MJ is pulling a little bit away with the lead and is probably the favorite for a runoff. She's currently benefiting from millions of dollars in ad spending by a group called Vote Vets, which works to elect more veterans. It's a Democratic group that works to elect more veterans to office. And so at this point, it may be a little, if you're trying to stop someone's momentum, it may be a little fruitless to go after MJ Hagar because no one's going to be able to compete with the millions of dollars that she's currently benefiting from on the outside. And so that means there's going to be a lot of focus, I think, on that number 2 spot in the runoff. I'm interested to see who trains their fire on who, and maybe revealing of who thinks who is a threat for that number 2 spot in the runoff.
Yeah, that's the other thing that I think is going to be interesting to see is this is a fight for second place. I think we can say with confidence, most people expect us to go to a runoff in May, and so that is what we're looking for tonight, is who is going to make it to that runoff. And so we certainly invite you guys to be sure to tune in today. That debate is going to start at 6:30 p.m. right here on KVUE. You can watch the first 30 minutes of it on TV, but obviously with 11 candidates, we're going to be talking for way longer than 30 minutes. So the whole debate is an hour and a half. You can watch that whole debate on the KVUE website, on the KVUE Facebook page, our YouTube page. KUT is going to stream it. So if you have to go anywhere, if you have to leave your house, don't worry. You've got a radio in that car. 90.5 is going to play the whole thing. If you guys love the Texas Tribune, don't worry. They're going to have it on their website too. There is no excuse not to watch this debate, and make sure you get out and vote, Texas. Early voting has already started. It runs for 2 weeks, and that primary election happening on March 3rd. We thank you guys so much for joining us. Right now, we hope to see you tonight.